Neptune forces combined with other planetary forces. Neptune and Saturn. Neptune with Saturn are in the opposite aspects. Hence those forces for sudden change that have to do with water, with the aspects of the elemental forces, become a part of the entity innately. Hence the intuitive forces in the experiences of the entity. We find in Neptune the abilities in expression of the mysteries and the mental forces as expressed in the Mercurian influences with same, also those things having to do with places near to water. However, with those influences of Saturn so oft entering, we find that even though there are the abilities for a long mental mind, there is the forgetfulness of names or faces. Also from Saturn, as combined with urges from material sojourns as will be seen, there are the tendencies for sudden and unexpected changes, as if directed in such change by unseen, unexpected sources. Know that he, thy ideal, hath need of thee. Thus the greater injunction would be to quit thyself as one who may be worthy to be entrusted with the directing of thy fellow men, in those things as bring harmony and peace in the material world, assurance and peace in the spiritual realm, that may bring safety in the activity with others, as may be prompted from thy interpretation in word, and more indeed of the law of truth in dealing with thy fellow men. Neptune and Mars. Astrologically we find rather Mars and Neptune only. Thus the interest in the mystical, and being a busybody about it at that. These are very well, but know in what spirit ye do everything, and that in the spirit of truth, and find it in thine own self. For there it may indeed be put to work for good. And those of the conflicts between that of Mars and in Neptune, brings for aversion to conditions as respecting foreign, yet foreign relations would be the better study for the entity, and the entity will ever find those that live close to large bodies of water, and those that have crossed or are to cross large bodies of water, are interesting, and the entity will find that in its experience, those things that will make the greatest changes in the life, will have to do with firearms, and with water, or fire and water. Neptune and Venus. The influences from Neptune and Venus make for a peculiarity, as it were, in the social relationships and the types of individuals, for the entity finds periods when certain types or forms of individual activities are appealing to the urges from within. And these may be of the egotistical self, either responses to self and self's emotions that may be motivative by the active forces of the aggrandizing of self, or by the constructive forces that build to that which is of a spiritual intent and purpose. Know these things, for they are before thee day by day. The interests from the Neptune sojourn make for the love of the mystery. Thus we find in Venus as in Neptune the power of thought, the interest of the entity ever in spiritual things, spiritual matters concerning that from which there emanates the growth of ideas, purposes and activities. For instance, influences through and over water would make for the natural inclinations or tendencies of the entity, and the abilities to see, to draw upon, to live in the beauties of same, rather than in that which is the nature of becoming stalemated, as it might be termed, by the very forces as in the Uranian activity. Which bring periods of extreme, or of doubt which arises occasionally in the experience, yet also the interest in the occult forces, which are quite varied from the spiritual. To the entity, cultivate the spiritual rather than occult or phenomena only. In Neptune as combined with Venus, we find the intrigues that have been a part of the entity's experience in a social way, or in the activities with individuals and groups, as well as things pertaining to bodies of water, and oft desiring to be upon same. And the entity oft is able to think or choose better under water environs than in the higher altitudes, or those far from bodies of water. We find in Venus the maternal, the filial, the marital associations. Thus these find expression in the material associations in the present. The greater force is Neptune. Thus the entity will have much in this experience to do with those who travel on, work in, travel over, acquainted with or a part of the water, oceans, seas, lakes, rivers. Hence the entity should always dwell close by water, especially running water. There, by such, the entity may meditate the better. In the latent urges we find Venus and Neptune, water, beauty and nature will have much to do with those things that may be used as policies or measures for influencing or directing the activities of the entity, in reasoning with the entity. Things that will have to do with nature, the outdoors, and with business, or any form or character of exchange in business, will be channels through which there may be made the greater appeal to the entity in its practice of relationships, as well as the channels in which greater abilities may be manifested from those activities of the entity in its relationships in the earth through other experiences, as well as those that may be brought to the front in the present. The earth signs, or the elements of earth, air, water, are the appealing forces, yet these are very material in their reactions. Thus the necessity, during those periods of the early training, for a spiritual import to be implanted in the mind of the entity. While the appeal may be made through nature, as this will be a study of the entity, we find that this is not sufficient. Spiritual forces and spiritual imports must form the basis for mental as well as spiritual activities. We find in Venus and Neptune the beauty of home, the activities in the creative field, or those wherein there might have been a demonstrated experience in the making of things. For, the entity might have been a very good inventor for practical household articles, if there had been the application in that direction. He had an idea for a churn once, would have been well to have carried through. Neptune and Uranus. The influences in Neptune and Uranus show much of the innate expression of self in its relationships to waters and large bodies of waters, and the vibrations that come from same are either a hopeful thing or a sad experience, either of extremes in its material expression, as we shall see and have seen in the experience of the entity in its earthly sojourns. In Neptune, with influences in the Uranian force, we find the mysticism of the occult forces, the spiritual domination with the experience of the entity, yet, as in the occult only, one may find the two-faced or that which is either good or bad. Only in the mind of man is it good or bad, for the constructive forces are of all good, which is God. Also the entity's sojourn in Uranus and Neptune makes for its interests in those things of the mystic occult natures that deal rather with the initiate and the influences that prompt from the baser, as well as the spiritual and the higher influences in the activities of entities, of individuals, of the greater masses. The associates in those environs also make for the interests of the entity, innate and manifested, in the higher influences in spiritual welfare of others, yet making, in the manner of application, as it were, that which has closed the entity to many of its own possibilities in these directions. As to the Neptune influence, pertaining to water and the mystic, as well as the Uranian, the occult, we find that the type of writing, the types of creative influence in the mental forces, are influenced by same. Hence the character of story or the like in which the entity might excel, would have to do with the sea, or love stories pertaining to individuals cast upon South Sea Isles, or jungle activities, or the activities of a purely spiritual or holy life, as in the experience of those dedicating themselves to such relationships, those who take the vows of celibacy, whether male or female characters, or the relationships as might exist between both taking the vow, and then influenced by the material forces which might be in their experience, or as to being castaways, or as to being in unusual conditions or positions or places. From the Uranian sojourn we find the extremes, but more in the Neptune, as it makes for then the mysterious things that have been and are a part of the experience, in relationships with things having to do with individuals who come over or who dwell close to water. Things having to do with the products of water also may be a part of the entity's experience. Those fields of activity as in underwriting insurance, as in bonds or stocks, or those things pertaining to tradings of any nature, are the natural outlet for the abilities of the entity. Especially marine insurance, or the underwriting of such, would be an ideal outlet for the entity's abilities, not only from the astrological, but from the earthly sojourns. In Neptune we find the mystical, while in Uranus the extremes and the occult. Do not let these confuse thee. For with benevolent influences in both Uranus and Neptune, which brings travel to the life, much will be gained by the entity in the study of occult and mysticism, but temper same with judgment. Hence from Uranus and Neptune, we find the delving into mysteries. All forms of psychic influence are of special interest to the entity. Yet oft the entity discredits its own experiences. Hold closer to the ideal, that it is not by might nor by power, but by the spirit of truth that one accomplishes spiritually, not by entities, but by the spirit of truth, and there is one truth. From Uranus as well as Neptune, we will find that the associations and activities close to large bodies of water should ever be a part of the experience. For, the mysteries of creative influences as well as the answers to the indecisions may come most to fruition by the spirit of truth. That grows not in superstition, not in mystery, but in true beauty of love, patience, long-suffering and kindness. And for the entity, most of all, tolerance. To all. For their convictions. For, in him, who is the truth and the light, is the opportunity for knowledge, for understanding, that comes only with the practice of those influences indicated in the dealings with the fellow man. From Uranus and Neptune, we find those influences having to do with the unusual or the mystical, and the occult and mystical also become a part of the entity's activity. Do not confuse the two. For, in the occult it may be in the extremes. While in the mystical will become more of that having to do when materialized with things pertaining to symbols or signs, or both symbols and signs, and things over water or upon water as a part of the experience. As in Neptune, with Uranus and Aries influence, will make for those influences that waters, and those of mystic forces, or occult influences, will ever have, as in suggestion, an influence in the experience of the body. Allowing self to become subject to, rather than dominating the influences or suggestion, would make the entity a subject of, rather than being able to subject that is not useful and using that which may be dominated, or to dominate that which is harmful in the experience of the entity. One that will have the more cares in the later days, as pertaining to the understandable things in universal forces. One that may give much to the universe through the touch as is made in that of the Uranian and of the forces as are in Neptune, yet one not having reached the highest development that may be attained in these spheres. For the entity should be near large bodies of water, that the urge may be reached through that element that is given from the bigness of such bodies, that are elemental in their manner of bringing urge to other individuals that may be awakened, through the elements of mental, spiritual and mystic forces. Being of the Uranian, and also in Neptune, elements pertaining to music, poetry, the arts, are especially that to which the mental abilities rest upon, and the forces as applied to the entity attune themselves much to such. Then, the entity will gain through such experience that as may be applied in the life, as one capable of intuitively aiding many, if fear will be replaced by love, not sentiment, but by that which casteth out fear, making all things possible through him, who is the lamp, the guide, the light, the life to the entity, in this and in other experiences. In Uranian and Neptune, those influences of an innate longing for an understanding of unseen, unknown forces in nature, in mental force, in man's experience. Neptune and Uranus make for an interest in reading matter that is of an unusual nature. Things that pertain to mysteries, or conditions in individuals' or groups' lives that are unusual, the uncanny and such, are of special interest to the entity. And, for the better development of the entity, as it develops or progresses through the experiences of this sojourn, the dwelling near large bodies of water, or upon large bodies of water, will be the natural elements for the development, giving rise to the abilities both in the occult and in the mystic influences. Hence, from the sojourns and the experience of the entity in the earth, the abilities of the entity will lend themselves to electrical engineering, navigation, or seafaring in some form or manner. Yet law, and such things pertaining to law, will hold also an interest for the entity. In the entering, we find in both Neptune and Uranus coming those particular interests as may be found, not only in mystery and in occult forces, but in that especial application of same. Especially in this individual life, there will be found much of those conditions that will be out of the ordinary, for, as is seen under the Uranian forces, there has. And is yet to come. Especially in the latter portion of the present year. Those conditions that will bring exceptional opportunities for expansion to this entity, especially from across large bodies of water, and of the entity's visit to those old scenes, as would be termed from present experience. Of the endeavors as the entity has had in this material plane, for many are the appearances. Much has been the development. Much has been the retarding. And much has been the advancing of the entity, for, as is given, these are as the application of will, which is the developing factor in and through the material plane. The experiences in Uranus with Neptune make for those things that have to do both with air and with things of electrical natures in their activity, and when these are dealing with the influences in the air as pertain to water, they will be more beneficent in the experience of the entity. And in this, from the material standpoint of those fields that have been chosen as the activities in a material world, if these are turned more and more into those fields that will partake both of the receiving as well as the sending of things as pertain to communication over waters, or under waters, or in waters, they will make for those experiences that may bring from the physical standpoint the greater activities in the experience of this entity. As an operator of such instruments that may be sent, undersea crafts, or those that may direct from given points aircrafts or machines, and as communications with those as to what is accomplished by those things in such activity, may the entity develop that which will make a record of same. As we will see from other experiences that have been indicated. The influences and sojourns from Uranus and Neptune make for associations in regard to elements of air and water, becoming the impelling force in the experience. And those things pertaining to the mysteries in life, whether to one of these elements or the other, are of particular interest to the entity. As these abilities for the activities in such directions arise, not only the occult influences or forces become active in the experience, but those mysteries that would deal with chemistry or the elements of any activity become innately a portion of the entity's urge. As to whether these things that deal with the innate abilities and qualities that seek expression are to be used for constructive influence in the experience or as a destructive force rests in the choice of the entity. These influences will do arise, in the experience in the present. As to how these are to be applied is as to whether the entity's soul becomes a growth or is retarded in its influence and in its own activity. For it is not what one knows, either mentally or spiritually, that is the impelling force, but what one does about and with what one knows is the influence that is brought into manifestation by the activities of the entity. For spirit is the motivating force of matter. If the developed influences of an entity in matter arise from the constructive, a growth must ensue. If they be turned into questionings or even doubts for self, retardments or a quick change must come. Neptune and Mercury. In Mercury we find the high mental abilities. As in the watery planet. Or in the activities of Neptune. We find beauty of body and the expressing of same if it is in activity, yet this is a warning also. As it brings this character of experience. Do not be too daring in the water, else we may bring a cutting short of the opportunities and experiences in the present sojourn. Also from the Mercurian sojourn there arises a high mental influence and a studious nature in the activities of the entity, yet these with the afflictions in the Neptune influence, as the mysteries in the experiences of the entity, may cause unexpected thoughts or turns to be found at times in the experience of the entity, by those that would watch the development or be inclined to direct the activities of the entity in the material experiences. We find in Mercury as well as in Neptune the universal consciousness as to the moral and spiritual relationships. These need to be stressed, especially in the present experience of the entity. Stress also in the fruit of thy endeavors as a writer, and as one that may depict strange scenes or environs, if this is sought by the entity to be used as a constructive experience in the minds and hearts of others. In Mercury we find the great mental abilities will be manifested, while in Neptune, we will find the interest in the unusual or the mystical, and the tender trend. As should and will be the expression if there is the proper training. For an actress or entertainer, or that is would pertain to the air or aerial activities. In Mercury we find the high mental forces, in Jupiter the universal consciousness, in Neptune the interest in and the abilities as an orator, a teacher, a director, an instructor in the arts or kindred activities, interest in the unusual and the occult, all of these, from the relationships of one of these consciousnesses with another. Mercury and Neptune are among the ruling influences, hence in the developments mentally. High mental attributes, with the inclination to receive same. As it were in mysterious manner, and to find water and the elements that make for influences in the affairs of those about the entity changing the environs for the entity. The elements as those that control man in his activity, or the appetites of the body, control the environs of the entity during its early portion of development. Hence appetites, or those things that become as the habits of the body-mind, always in this experience will mentally play an important part in the surroundings, the development of the mental body. These, to be sure, may be changed. If the entity will change the realm in which the mental body may dwell, for as one thinketh in the heart, so does the speech, the activity, belie that which that body thinketh. Or the altering of environs of influences that make for destined forces in the experience, complying with the laws of the spiritual forces that are seen innate in the experience through the sojourn in Neptune, bringing water sign, and the body should ever live, should ever dwell by large bodies of water. Not necessarily fresh salt water, or the fountain of life, as the material world knows same, would be better than fresh. For the very vibrations of same would change in the effect upon those intonations and incantations of the inner self, in attuning itself to the elements of activity through which much may come into the experience of the entity, not of material things. Neptune and Jupiter. We find in Jupiter the influence for the activities to be activative upon the lives of many peoples, as well as in Neptune the water, the creative, the new ideas, new relationships, changes of every nature, as well as the ability to tone and color such activities. Use that thou hast in hand day by day. Neptune brings the greater spiritual life, greater desire for the spiritual emotions than the purely material. Hence those influences in which the entity may bring much good, not so much of a denominational nature, but rather of a spiritual activity, these may bring those channels of influence and forces, in which greater harmony, greater joy, greater outlet may be found for the abilities of self. These as we find, combined with the influences in Jupiter, make for more of a universal influence, as in affiliation or association with the distribution of that which is as a teaching influence in the lives of young and old alike. These would be the channels or natures, or in the distribution of such. Whether they be tracts or books or such, these should be a portion of the entity's experience, if there would be the greater abilities for influence in this experience. Hence we find the influence in Jupiter with Neptune makes for the innate expressions or desires of the entity to be a rover, a wanderer as it were, yet seeking ever an expression, or that something which is latent or just beyond the horizon. Such an attitude at times brings into the experience doubts and fears of others, as respecting the entity's purpose, the entity's attitude towards the real abilities that are a portion of the entity's experience. Sincerity is the greater virtue of the entity, though not always interpreted as such by others, as will be seen by the sojourns in which attitudes or relationships assumed or taken, brought into the experiences of others those fears or doubts, as respecting the entity's adaptability to the environs, or consequences as would arise from choices taken, or from circumstances which arose. In those influences in Jupiter and in Neptune, we find the broadness of vision, the broadness of influence the entity may have upon those whom the entity contacts. While in the present experience, as in the last 2 years, we have found that these are rather remote in the entity's experience, coming rather as hopes or promises from individuals, from groups, from those forces, as the entity hopes to gain in the mental body, as to apply in relationships with others, yet to the entity, these may become realities as the entity, through that influence in the Pisces, which makes for a cult, that in the Neptune of the mysterious or mystery forces of life, tending for those of ritualistic form or manner, yet to the entity these are held rather as a necessary application in the individual life, as to reach certain conclusions or positions, or aims, yet these should not be allowed to become as principles, rather as those forces that are as basic for principles to be established from, by the entity's own experience. Well for the entity to gain that difference in those making as personalities from the astrological and from the relationships as exist in the present experience. In those influences in the experience in the present experience of the entity, we find one that has at times been easily influenced by others, at other periods seemingly taking definite stands without rhyme or reason. At times both experiences have been for the betterment of the entity in this experience. Will the entity apply self rather in those influences as may be had through that of Jupiter with Neptune, in the present experience, we would find the influences in the entity's present life to be a changed and altered condition entirely. While not the mysterious forces, yet rather those influences in Neptune as brings for the understanding of the spiritual influence in the life, as related to those in Venus or the love life of the entity that, aided with the influence in Jupiter, as is to reign in the next few years, would bring a stabilizing influence in the experience of the entity, as to make a development in material and mental aspects in the whole spiritual life of the entity. These, as we find, must begin within the present or coming season, would they be made for the greater benefits in the experience of the entity. While, with the influences of Jupiter and of Neptune, we find one that regards what others may say, still continues to have ideas and ideals that are not always in keeping with what is ordinarily considered as being just in track with the common run of social conditions or social positions. Hence we find one, to many, a very unactive entity in many respects when the mind and the inner expressions of the entity are so out of the ordinary as not to be even classed with the common run, as would slangily be expressed. This, as we find, is an old entity upon this plane and has gone far in the developing. With the forces of Jupiter and Neptune, with Venus and the better forces, gives the great insight into the entity's forces and much of intuitive forces that become beyond those of the normal.